Hey everybody, True Dill Tom here. Today I wanted to make a quick video touching on traditionalism again. However, this time I wanted to look at statistics. Now, if you are familiar with my other videos, you will know that I often speak in a language that is a little esoteric. I talk about the inner spiritual corruption that plagues the Western world, and I don't know, I would imagine only a certain type of person would understand what I'm asking for. So, that being a person that shares a certain dissonance for the modern world and instead looks for inspiration from the old world. So, that being said, I thought I'd make some more down-to-earth videos looking at specific issues and maybe give you guys some new information to consider when you ask yourselves how you want to live your life. And for now, I wanted to talk about sex. Now, I would recommend you watch my last video on the subject because I'm not going to reiterate myself, but if you did watch it, you would know that as traditionalists, we want a lifestyle that is coherent with wider civilization, which isn't to say everybody else around us, but rather society as a process from beginning to end, as the traditional man is one that lives for all time. They aren't localized to their moment in history and have a doctrine that they adhere to, which is eternal. Now, traditionalism comes in many forms. Some of you will be Christian traditionalists, and we will have disagreement because after all I'm an atheist, while others might be like Evola, who seek to reconcile the work of authors such as Nietzsche with a greater religious tradition. But nonetheless, whatever your goals are, sex is something very important in the traditionalist worldview. It may be not the forefront of investigation, but it goes without saying that the modern world's way of expressing sexuality is degenerate. It is clear that the 20th century and what we have seen of so far of the 21st century makes a monumental failure of modern man to find a honest, intimate, and truthful understanding of sexuality, most notably because it is at this point in history that man has limited his sexuality to reproductive or biological forces. Now, some would say this is a materialist reductionism, but I would contest it because it neglects any real effort to examine the good life. It has no regard for duty or virtue or human excellence. It is a view that asks us not to reach above us for that which is transcendent, but to slouch downwards towards that which is reducible, formless, and hedonistic. It is a picture-perfect example of creeping nihilism in the West, but when it comes to having a doctrine of sex that escapes the grasps of modernity, there are many positions people take. For instance, as an atheist, my own position on this differs from the Christian tradition that sees reproduction as a part of the divine order of things and thus places sanctity upon sex, justifying prohibition against sexual acts that are premarital or even non-reproductive. Instead, I personally view sexuality as the unification between man and woman, as historically mankind has thought to have been divided into male and female, and just as the ancient Greek myth of Hermaphroditus, the young boy that was turned into a hybrid of male and female by a nymph, sex is symbolic of the union between the sexes, between male and female, and this is my effort to construct a view of sexuality that, unlike how it is practiced in the modern world, has form and structure to it. However, perhaps this is for another video. I just wanted to give some brief background as to where I was coming from before I drop some statistics to make my case. So, firstly, we will be looking at linkages between sexual activity, including amount of sexual partners and how early in life one becomes sexually active, and quality of life, including likelihood to experience mental illness, rates of divorce, and so on. And now, most data here is from the Center for Disease Control of the United States Department of Health and Human Services. They have a national survey of family growth conducted in 1995 that surveyed a nationwide sample of 10,000 women. So let's first churn through the statistics and then I'll give my further commentary on it. Now, the first thing to make out, which is quite obvious, is that the younger the age a woman becomes sexually active, it correlates quite highly with how many sexual partners they will have. As you can see here, initiation of sexual activity at a younger age is linked to higher numbers of sexual partners. The earlier a woman begins sexual activity, the more sexual partners she will have during her lifetime. Girls who begin voluntary sexual activity at age 13 to 14 will have, on average, more than 13 voluntary sexual partners during their lives. By contrast, women who begin sexual activity at age 23 to 24 will have on average 2.7 sexual partners during their lives. But of course, the reason this might be is simply because if they have been sexually active for longer, then that's more time to potentially have sex with people. It's not necessarily as if in one given year a 20-year-old woman who became sexually active at 13 is going to have more sexual partners than a 20-year-old woman who became sexually active at 18. However, If we look at age of voluntary sexual intercourse and turnover rate, that is how many sexual partners the adult woman being surveyed has on average per year, we see the same positive correlation. It reads, women who begin sexual activity at early ages also have far higher turnover rates among sexual partners. The sex partner turnover rate may be defined as the number of voluntary sexual partners per year of sexual activity. Girls who begin sexual activity at age 13 or 14 have on average 1.2 partners per year of sex activity. By contrast, women who begin sex activity at ages 21 to 22 have 0.3 sex partners per year of sexual activity. Thus, women who become sexually active at ages 13 to 14 have a partner turnover rate 4 times higher than those who initiate sex activity in their early 20s. But now let's look at the linkages between amount of premarital sexual partners and various negative life consequences. So this first graph here illustrates that women who have more non-marital sexual partners are more likely to be infected with sexually transmitted diseases. And now, this would seem fairly obvious, but it reads, quote, the chart shows the impact of increases in the number of lifetime sexual partners on the chances of being infected by a sexually transmitted disease, STD. The chart covers all sexually active women. Women with 0 non-marital partners have had sex only with men whom they married. Some 3.6% of sexually active women who have had 0 non-marital sex partners have contracted syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, genital warts, or genital herpes, or have a self-reported high risk of HIV. By contrast, the STD infection rate of women with 11 to 15 non-marital sexual partners is nearly 10 times higher. Some 30% of those women have been infected. In addition, we can see how there is a correlation between women who have had more premarital sex and single motherhood, as well as giving birth out of wedlock. So here we can see a graph that illustrates the latter. It writes, quote, this chart shows the relationship between the number of non-marital sexual partners and giving birth to a child out of wedlock. All the women represented in the chart are or have been sexually active. The women in the far left-hand column were virgins at the time of first marriage and have been married to all the men with whom they have had voluntary intercourse. Some 1.7% of these women have had out-of-wedlock birth. The small number of women in this category who have had children out of wedlock typically became pregnant while married but divorced before the child was born. See appendix. The adjacent column represents women whose first intercourse was premarital, i.e. they were sexually active with a man they later married. If these women later divorced, they married any other man with whom they subsequently had been sexually active. Some 16% of these women gave birth out of wedlock before marrying the father of the child. The other columns represent women who have had 1 or more non-marital sexual partners. As the number of lifetime non-marital sexual partners rises, so does the probability of having a child out of wedlock. Nearly half of the women with 5 non-marital sexual partners have had an out of wedlock birth. And regarding single motherhood, we can see a correlation from this graph here, which reads, quote, this chart shows the relationship between the number of non-marital sexual partners and single parenthood. All the women represented on this chart are mothers with children. The left-hand column represents women who have sex only with men they have married. Some 7% of these mothers were single parents at the time of the survey. 93% were married. The probability of being a single mother rises as the number of lifetime non-marital sex partners rises. And some 53% of mothers with 5 lifetime non-marital sex partners were single parents at the time of the survey. Now, of course, this is tragic. I've spoken about the effects of single motherhood on wider society before. A long time ago, in fact, in my video entitled On Pornography, which I would recommend checking out. So, I thought I'd just play the clip because it is important to understand how serious such an outcome is, and if you want to watch the whole video, I'll put the link in the description. And the traditional family is the sole best method of distributing resources in society. Having a unit that divides labor between husband and wife is the best method of childbearing, contrasted by single parenthood, in which 90% of welfare recipients are single mothers, 70% of gang members, high school dropouts, teen suicides, teen pregnancies are also raised by single mothers, 63% of suicides nationwide are individuals from single parent families, 75% of children in chemical dependency hospitals are from single parent families, more than half of all youth incarcerated in the US lived in one parent families as a child. So as you heard me explain 8 months ago, and has been hammered home by people like Stefan Molyneux and the rest many times before, the societal effects of single motherhood is very detrimental. And now that being said, let's move on to look at the next graph entitled, Women who have more non-marital sexual partners are less likely to have stable marriages. And as you can see, the correlation for this graph is particularly strong. It reads, quote, "This chart covers sexually active women over the age of 30. Women were defined as having a stable marriage if they were currently married and had been in the same marriage for at least 5 years. Women who had more non-marital sex partners were less likely to have stable marriages. Over 80% of the women who had never had a non-marital sexual partner were in stable marriages, and by contrast, only 30% of the women with 5 non-marital sex partners were in stable marriages." But now let's look at the linkages between non-marital sexual partners and abortion. This is of course a large correlation. Seeing the more sexual partners you have, the more likely you are to be pregnant. This chart shows the relationship between the number of lifetime non-marital sex partners and abortion. The greater the number of non-marital sex partners a woman has, the greater the probability she will have an abortion. So some 7.6% of sexually active women with 0 non-marital sex partners have had an abortion. By contrast, over half the women with more than 20 non-marital sex partners have had an abortion. But moving on, this one is more crucial point and probably one of the most persuasive in terms of why people should live a traditional life, and in my opinion this is a sort of shoddy reason to be persuaded by it in compared to the last ones, but such is the nature of people, and that is that women who have had more non-marital sexual partners are less likely to be happy. It reads, quote, "This chart shows that the inverse relationship between personal happiness and the number of lifetime non-marital sexual partners. The greater the number, the non-marital sex partners, the lower the probability of personal happiness. The chart covers all sexually active women. Some 56% of women who have had sex only with men they married report they are currently very happy. As the number of non-marital sex partners increases, the probability that a woman will report she feels very happy shrinks. Only 37% of women with 5 non-marital sex partners report they are very happy." So this of course makes sense in light of the next graph we will look at entitled, "Women who have more non-marital sexual partners are likely to be depressed." It reads, quote, "This chart shows the relationship between the number of lifetime non-marital sexual partners and depression. The greater the number of non-marital sex partners, the higher the probability of depression. Only 2.8% of women who have had sex only with men they married report they currently feel not very happy or very unhappy, and by contrast, 8.3% of women with 16 to 20 non-marital sex partners report they currently feel not very happy or very unhappy." Now this is pretty enlightening, but I can imagine a lot of people would wonder, how do you know these correlations are causal? While also, how do you know the direction of the causation? Is it that women become more unhappy and so on when they have more sexual partners, or do women who are unhappy and depressed and etc. feel more inclined to have sex? Well, I don't think the answers to any of these questions are actually that important, because firstly, none of these studies are reproducible in men. It seems that men have the ability to play the field, so to speak, and not exhibit any bad repercussions on their health, relationships, or other life choices, with the exception of STDs, obviously. So thus, as men, we are given the question, just as women are, of who we want to settle down with, of who we want to let into our lives. And when you meet a woman that has gone this off the rails, it's a point worth considering. It's worth thinking about, because although a potential partner of yours who has had many sexual partners already might tell you it was in the past and it's none of your business, the fact is, regardless of which way the causation goes, those past choices tell you a lot about who they will be in the future. And although you can make your own decisions, and perhaps you have found someone who you believe to be an outlier to the before mentioned statistical reality, a promiscuous woman is undoubtedly a red flag. But guys, this was just a video I wanted to make quickly to fill some people in who might not be aware of the data when it comes to these issues, as I was made aware of on my Discord. Despite a lot of this stuff being hammered pretty hard in the manosphere and Catholic Twitter, etc., I thought it would be good to try and spill some of it over onto my subscriber base. But yeah, that being said, I'll catch you guys later. Remember to hit up my Patreon, merch, social media, my Twitter and my Instagram. I'm posting there a lot, and all these links will be in the description. So see you.